last week we looked at 3 of the 4 servant songs of Isaiah, and I just a very quick recap. I said it every time we've looked at Isaiah, but Isaiah is really a school of prophets rather than an individual. And the first Isaiah is, generally people think is chapters 1 to 39, and then first Isaiah we call, second Isaiah is 40 to 55, and then 55 to 66 is what we call the third Isaiah, and they cover quite different periods of history, which is why we think they're 3 different people. First Isaiah is looking at the time when Assyria was threatening Israel. Second Isaiah looking at the time when the people are in exile in Babylon and about to return, and the third Isaiah is about the restoration of Israel after the Babylonian exile. So there are 3 quite distinct periods of history, but what we add on to that, 3 major kind of writers in there about particular things, but then somebody edits them all, and then somebody slots in other little bits, like the little Psalms of Zion that are in there, and the servant songs that we have here. So actually we start to think of Isaiah as being a kind of multi-authored collection of writings of the same kind of school, the same kind of thinking. And clearly, as we see next week, the strong influence of Isaiah on the New Testament and on Christian understanding. He becomes a very, very important book, and some people have called it the 5th gospel. It's so kind of closely associated with the message of Jesus. But what we've been trying to do in these 3 sessions and the ones that we had before Christmas is to separate how the New Testament writers looked at Isaiah from what happened at the time of the writings. So not see these as prophecy, future telling, but rather seeing it as the New Testament people looking back and reading their story through the eyes of Isaiah. This is different. And then last week we identified that that somebody called Duhm, D-U-H-M, a scholar about 100 or so years ago, argued that these 4 little passages were connected to each other, although in different places in the story, in the book, they seem to be connected because they're talking about this character, this figure of the servant. And so the question then emerges is, who is the servant? And I mean, I read somewhere that there was one famous commentator, Bible academic, who was writing his commentary on Isaiah, and he gave up because he just couldn't get his head around these servant songs and as to who might have written them and so on. So he just said he just gave up writing it because it was too complicated and too difficult. But we'll keep looking at it because it is very interesting. And I think last week, I identified some possible candidates, for the identity of the servant. Was it Zion, Jerusalem itself, the city? And remember last week I read a little bit from Lamentations, which is might have influenced the writings. Some people, and Jewish people particularly today, think the servant is Israel itself, the people of Israel. Some think it could be Isaiah the prophet, or it could be the Messiah. And Christians, of course, read that into that because they also see Jesus as the servant. So maybe it's the Messiah, and Jewish people think it could be the Messiah. It could be this character Cyrus, who was a Persian ruler who invaded Babylon, and when he invaded Babylon, he had a different policy, and he let the Hebrews go back to Israel. So he was a goodie. So maybe he was a servant, maybe it was Moses, maybe it was Jeremiah, maybe it was Zerubbabel, the king who was living in exile. Maybe it's the righteous people of every generation. Maybe it's the faithful remnant that's mentioned in Isaiah chapter 10. Maybe it's the high priest, Onias, who was taken into exile. You know, all of these kind of candidates at some point have been put forward as being a possible, a possible identity for the servants. I have a feeling that actually the identity is deliberately fluid. And the writer is kind of almost teasing us into thinking could be this person, could be that person, but also seeing that the servant is a metaphor for represents something that happened. So it could be at any given time the servant could have been any of those people, because it's the quality of the servant that matters, and what the servant does and experiences that matters more than actually who historically the writer was intending them to be. I don't know if that's making sense. So I thought this week we'd look at the fourth, and we talked about, I said in the sort of thing on the web that we talk about vicarious suffering, and the idea of people suffering on behalf of others, as opposed to having a pain in your leg or whatever it is. I mean, everybody suffers, and we don't understand the meaning of suffering sometimes, why it happens. And generally in the Old Testament, suffering is seen as if you like, as a product of sin. It's something which happens to people because of wrongdoing and so on. But it's also quite nuanced as well. So what you get in the Old Testament, I mean, some people argue that the idea of somebody suffering on behalf of others it only appears in the suffering servant. It only appears there, but perhaps there are clues to what it is in other parts of the Bible. So mostly, as I said, that the suffering is a cause of retribution. It's caused by wrongdoing. Suffering is different from pain, and that maybe we are in some way judged, but the New Testament is quite nuanced. The Old Testament rather is quite nuanced in the way it looks at that. So in Proverbs and Job, it might be seen as a disciplinary. I mean, it disciplines us. It gives us an experience through which we can grow. In some of the wisdom literature, it's something about suffering actually is preparation for death and the afterlife, when judgment sort of comes out. Or in Job, it's a sort of mystery. And Ecclesiastes too, it's a kind of mystery. So there are ways in which something is more nuanced than just God going to you, I'm going to make you suffer. We can see, for example, in Leviticus, the idea of sacrifice, in a way, is about suffering being taken by somebody else. So you put the suffering on the animal, and the animal suffers on behalf of. So the idea of sacrifice has got something in it about how suffering can be on behalf of. So the animal would suffer on behalf of the human being. And if you remember the idea of redemption, you know, that the law is that the firstborn son is to be given to the Lord, but you don't. What you have to do is, as Jesus did, you know, in the temple, you actually take a pair of turtle doves and pigeons, and instead of sacrificing your son, you know, to the Lord, you redeem your son by sacrificing a couple of pigeons. So the idea of, you know, sacrifice, taking on the suffering is kind of there, and also the idea in the Pentateuch that the Levites, the priests, took on the place of the people in the sanctuary. They sort of represented the people, and it was only the Levites who were the priests. So just that there isn't that big idea that appears in servant songs about the servant taking on the suffering of others, but there is somewhere in the background, you know, the idea that suffering can be taken on by another for another, if that makes sense, particularly through the notion of sacrifice. So having given that as background, maybe a good idea to read the passage. Yeah. Oh, what am I doing? The wrong thing, I know that. Okay. Oh, what am I doing? There, that's what I'm doing. You can see the passage, the Bible there.
Not yet.
Not yet. You can see it?
Yeah.
No.
Yes.
Okay. You can. Oh, well, I'll start again. Share again. There we go. See it now, yeah?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. No Harley here today.
Shall I read it then?
If you don't mind.
See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up and shall be very high. Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which had not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate. Who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hid their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living. stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked, and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring, and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured him out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressions. Yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors.
Okay. Any first thoughts on hearing it, and then we'll go through, it section by section.
It's hard to let go of what we've been taught so long about this passage, that this is Jesus. I mean, it is, but it's also lots of other things, I think. So it's hard to see it differently at the moment. I think I need to kind of spend time with it, really, and try and forget what I know.
Well, if you know Handel's Messiah,
Yeah.
all of these, this is major part of the sort of crucifixion part of the Handel's Messiah.
Yes.
And
sorry, this is probably off the agenda, but did Handel write that because that was how it was seen at the time, or was Handel the inspiration for others to see this passage differently?
Handel didn't write the text. Somebody else wrote the text.
Right. Okay. Well,
I can't remember the name of the person who wrote the text, but it was some clergyman somewhere wrote just selected Bible passages which kind of indicated the life of Jesus, and from throughout the Bible, which is really, it's quite an inspired kind of text. But I mean, it does kind of show the way in which people saw the story of Jesus as being, spread throughout the whole of the Bible, as opposed to being the story of the gospel.
So the writer was, I mean, obviously they were inspired, but they were building on tradition that was already there.
I would think so. I would imagine so. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, but I think it's quite interesting as we go through this, as to why it's so closely associated with Jesus.
Sorry.
Go on.
Let's throw another thought in. My first thought is that makes it easier. If we can see that Jesus is the one who has suffered and is bearing all this wretchedness upon him, then we can kind of go, well, that's the way it works, because that's the way God set it up from the word go. Jesus was there to redeem us. But if we allow it to become bigger than that, and then see other people as part of that, we can't say the same thing anymore. We can't say that their suffering was part of God's plan from the word go. Therefore, what can we do about it? It actually then becomes something we have responsibility for. In a way, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think in a way that if it's all put on Jesus, then it's not our responsibility in quite the same way. We can feel sorry that, in the kind of evangelical kind of sense of this, that, we committed sin and Jesus has to bear it, but it's not quite the same thing as the homeless guy down the street who's homeless because of the policies of the nation that I live in.
Exactly.
I think there's a difference.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great.
So looking at first, in Second Isaiah, there's a lot of references to the Exodus, because he was writing when the people of the Hebrews were about to come back to Israel from Babylon, having been refugees. So he sees this as another Exodus event, you know, an equivalent of the story of the Exodus, coming out of slavery into Israel. The Hebrews are about to come back from exile. Every valley shall be exalted, every hill shall be made low, the crooked places plain, you know, a highway for our God. You know, people are given the opportunity to come back. Now, the servant songs don't, on the surface, give any reference to the Exodus, even though in the rest of Second Isaiah there are lots of references. But in the very first verse, you see my servant shall prosper. In fact, the word servant doesn't mean a domestic servant, it means a slave. So the very notion of the servant links us immediately to the Exodus. In Exodus itself, it says, first chapter of Exodus, it says, the Egyptians became ruthless, imposing tasks on the Israelites, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tax that they imposed on them. So in the story of the Exodus, there's the idea of oppression, you know, the idea that this is being imposed on the people. And in that word servant is a resonance of, you know, the experience of the Israelites, because it really should be translated, see my slave shall prosper. And we've got used to that word servant in Christian language and do that. But actually, even in the New Testament, many times that it's translated servant should be translated slave. So this is going to be a reversal. Yeah. And the word prosper there, I think it's got a link to posterity, you know, to continuing, which is also quite interesting, as we'll see that could it be that the servant, that it is the disciples of the prophet or the disciples of the servant who are writing this and saying, look, the words are going to continue. And I think that comes in a bit later on as well. And that the teachings of this servant is going to continue. And there's something very immediate and specific, isn't there? I mean, this is something that's happening to somebody. Many astonished him. Mars is his appearance, beyond human sense, form as that. He shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. Which is interesting. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. But then you see in verse 7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. So you've got that change around. The kings shut their mouths, you know, because of him, and yet he himself does not open his mouth. There's a sort of parallel there. So we've gone. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just looking at that next line beyond what you've referred to, Vaughan. But sorry, in line, verse 16, I think it is. But
16.
No, further up. Sorry, in the previous chapter.
Oh, in the previous chapter. Sorry.
Where it says
15.
Yeah. The strange construction, for that which had not been told them, they shall see. It's a really strange way of putting it. Because there's lots of things you wouldn't tell someone, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate. So,
I mean, yeah, there is a question as to whether or not there is some coded language here,
right?
Because Isaiah is very supportive of Cyrus, the Persian emperor, but he's writing in Babylon, where
Right.
Cyrus would be the enemy. So maybe there is a bit of kind of coded language in this, and maybe it is about what has been suppressed because the people were refugees and in
Okay.
exile, actually coming into the open and being able to be seen. You know what has been happening to us. It can now be identified and spoken of. And if the servant was a particular person who, you know, the writer knows about, and if the suffering that's being described here is the suffering of a particular person, then maybe they were somebody who was being persecuted politically, and therefore there needed to be this kind of coded.
Right, okay.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay.
Who has believed? Who has believed? Now we get a shift actually, because if you remember the first little passage, it's God who is speaking, and then this next passage, it's human speaking about the sort of humiliation. Who has believed what we have heard? Who has believed? And you can parallel that in the way he does in 9. Although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. So who has believed? You know, this person who's doubted at the beginning there, but then he has done no violence. There's no deceit in his mouth. And then you get this, then you get this description of a person, you know, where he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. As one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Let me get my Bible. Again, looking at the sort of the Exodus, you know, kind of theme. In Exodus chapter 1, we read this, you know, therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. You've got this kind of Exodus kind of hint again, you know, that there is there's something being laid on people. He's carrying the oppression, and then in Deuteronomy, where it says, "Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted." In Deuteronomy, it says, "The Lord will turn away from you every illness, all the dread diseases of Egypt that you have experienced. He will not inflict on you, but he will lay them on all who hate you." So again, this idea of it is in Egypt there was these infirmities, these diseases, and people were struck down. So, you know, again, this fluid thing, is this Israel? And is this servant Israel describing the past sufferings of Israel? Or is it a particular person who has suffered? If you go to verse 5, but he was wounded, and wounded could be translated pierced. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. Let me show you this. This is a carving from Babylon of Jews being impaled. And this was standard. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. No, I thought. Let me tell you what I've done. I don't know what's wrong with me tonight. Can you see it now?
No.
Can you see?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a carving from Babylon at the time of Jews being impaled. He was wounded, he was pierced. You see how they executed them. They actually impaled them on this stick. And it's a very graphic description. He was pierced, whoever he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was punishment that made us whole. By his bruises we are healed. It's horrible.
Yeah.
It is horrible. But can you sort of see how this text could be talking about a leader, a prophet, somebody who stood for the people and was executed, as a political prisoner, somebody who was speaking up for the people, and this recognition that the person had died, and that their death had been part of the struggle for freedom for the people, in the way, say, Oscar Romero was assassinated. It is possible.
Well, yeah, but if you take Jesus out of it, what does it mean by his bruises we are healed?
Well, I think take Jesus out of it because we can put Jesus back in fairly quickly, with this. What does it mean? I think it means that there are some people who push the boat out and stand up and take brave stands, and we all benefit from it. That there are people who, in very challenging circumstances, have actually been very, very brave, and the outcome of their bravery has been that a lot of people have had their lives have been made better. Can you see that there?
But then what about iniquities?
Well, I mean,
it's not, people aren't always punished because they've done things wrong in that context, if that's what iniquities means here.
I mean, I can't. I mean, the various dimensions to it, that I mean, what are the people's iniquities? We don't know. I mean, we can only speculate, but
I suppose you could argue that it's almost, maybe this is too strong, but it's almost being ironic, the iniquities that are perceived by those who've oppressed them.
Yeah, or failure to speak out, or
yeah, okay.
acquiescence with the situation, being too passive, There's lots of things this could be.
Okay.
And what I'm saying is not definitive, but what you can see here is the strong possibility that one possible understanding of this text is that there was a prophet who suffered, and that suffering was seen as exemplary and part of the freeing process for the people who were in exile. But if once you see that and see this picture, it's not very difficult to connect it to the crucifixion of Jesus.
No.
It's not difficult at all, and you can see there that why this passage becomes so closely associated with Jesus. And the question, does Jesus himself know that connection? Does Jesus see this himself in the decisions that he's made and the choices that he's making? Is he himself consciously making himself as the servant? But that's for next week. Okay. And are we like sheep? I mean, you've got the link to sacrifice there. Sheep the sacrifices, and again that goes. We have this iniquitous thing, we have all turned to our own way. So they've done something wrong. I mean, the people who feel that the we in this passage, whoever the we is, I've got some culpability for the death of the servant. We don't know what it is, but it says, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And in verse 8, this adds to this idea, that this was an execution. By a perversion of justice, he was taken away. And the taking away as well is really interesting. If we were to go back in Isaiah to the earlier in chapter 52, Isaiah wrote, "Oh, thus says the Lord God, long ago my people went down into Egypt to reside there as aliens. The Assyrian too has oppressed them without cause. Now therefore, what am I doing here, says the Lord? Seeing that my people are taken away without cause. Their rulers howl, says the Lord, and continually all day long my name is despised." So Isaiah has used the phrase taken away in the previous chapter to talk about the people being taken away into exile. So again, you can say this, well, maybe this is talking about a perversion of justice. He was taken away, or going back to the idea that it's Israel, by a perversion of justice, Israel was taken away into exile. And you've got there, they made, and verse 9, they made his grave with the wicked, his tomb with the rich. So there is the sort of implication of a criminal's burial well in that.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, it's quite vivid, isn't it? I mean, and that you don't have to read Jesus into this to read, execution and unjust punishment, either unjust treatment of a people or unjust treatment of a particular prophet leader. Yet, and then it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. Tough, eh? it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain.
Don't believe that.
I paused dramatically for you to come in there soon.
That's not true. God of love is not going to do that. No.
Yeah, well, maybe we can read it as, you know, God up in heaven thinking, oh, I fancy crushing this guy with pain just this week. Or, you know, actually those people who do suffer for the good of others are doing the will of the Lord. You know, it's God's will that people stand up for justice. Not that people, it isn't God's will that people are crushed with pain, but it is God's will that people stand up. And so if this person has made a brave stand, then they were doing the will of the Lord. I mean, I guess that's another way of reading it.
Okay, yeah.
Agree.
Maybe. I mean, yeah. We can't enter the mind of the writer to know there, but we can for ourselves say, well, no, I mean, that doesn't feel right. But on the other hand, people who do the will of the Lord sometimes get crushed with pain, you know.
So in effect, the fact that he was being crushed with pain shows that he was doing the will of the Lord.
Yeah.
Not that God was choosing to punish him or punish him, make him suffer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you take Oscar Romero, you know,
yeah, of course.
God did not say, let's shoot Oscar Romero today. But Oscar Romero was doing the will of the Lord by speaking out and putting himself in that risky position.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That's better, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then you get this phrase, when you make it like an offering for sin.
Oh God. Sin is a bad word.
Well, it can be translated in different ways. It can be translated guilt offering. It can be translated penalty, reparation, offering there. But most likely it's referring to the guilt offerings in the temple, which are talked about in Leviticus. So guilt is not, you know, as we have now, psychological trauma or something, but it's an offense against God. It's an infraction of the ritual rules, and so on. It's breaking the Torah, the law, and then there are kind of quite clear instructions in Leviticus for how to acquit yourself of absolve yourself of the sin that you've committed by making a sacrifice. So here I think it links back to the sheep earlier on. So this, when you make his life an offering for sin, so when God is speaking here, when the life of the servant has been offered as a sacrifice in the same way that an animal would happen, then you shall see his offering and shall prolong his days. Now, how do you prolong his days? This guy's already been laid in the dead with the wicked. So he's already dead and buried, but he's been offered as a guilt offering. He's been sacrificed to the sins of the people in that sense. But you shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. goes back to that very first sentence. See, my servant shall prosper. You see, and says, long his days, through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. And I think the sort of the idea there is that that the legacy of the servant is going to carry on. So, and I don't know why I keep going back to Romero. It's just it's come to my mind as we've been talking, you know. But he said, if they assassinate me, you know, I can't remember exactly what he said, but I shall rise again in the people, you know. So they can kill a bishop, you know, but I will rise again in the people, you know. And I think it's that similar idea. So possibility is that the servant was the prophet, and that it was the disciples of the prophet who, or a prophet, the disciple of the prophet, who writes this, saying that this person has been killed by the Babylonians, and we will continue his memory, and his words will prosper. Which says a lot about that book of Isaiah, you know, because that book of Isaiah is what has prospered, is what has continued. And the prophecy of Isaiah then is saved and preserved by the disciples, whoever put this together. So you get a clue in this as to who it is who is making this book and why they're collecting these writings, these words of this school of prophets called Isaiah, you know, which they call Isaiah, or after the first Isaiah. You know, you get an understanding as to what they're trying to do with the whole of the book. And I just actually let me just find it. It also links to another very significant passage which relates very closely to this, which is Psalm 22. And the very last words of the last two verses of Psalm 22. Well, the first verse is, my God, why have you forsaken me? The words of Jesus on the cross. And the last words of the psalm are, posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord and proclaim his deliverance to a people yet unborn, saying that he has done it. So in the psalm, which is always closely related to the servant songs and related equally to the death of Jesus, you get the idea that, you know, the word will continue through to posterity. Wow, there's too much in this. Just a kind of last thing, you know. Where are we? Verse 11. Out of his anguish you see light, you see satisfaction. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous. So you get the word servant at the beginning of the little section here, and you get the servant at the end. Servant is described as the righteous one. My servant shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. What do you make of it?
To take in there, isn't there?
There's a lot, isn't there? Yeah, I mean, it's kind of unpacking it to see what they're talking about, what they're describing, what it possibly could be, and the kind of levels of meaning to it. You know, so it could be a particular person who, you know, suffered and died and was an inspirational leader. It could be the people of Israel, you know, you know, and it's something which just speaks again and again and again historically to particular situations and particular people and particular acts of courage and bravery and willingness to carry the, you know, the burden So it's sort of also talking about history as well. It's talking about Israel's history in Egypt, carrying the burden, carrying the infirmities, and yeah, this almost kind of universal experience of humanity to be a servant. You know, that there are servants.
It's also speaking of human nature, isn't it? Because this is, as you say, what always happens. You know, we know that we admire the people who are the servants more than those who lord it over us. Makes you wonder why we keep going through the same cycles.
Yeah.
You know, why we will never admire Putin, but we would admire Zelensky. And
yeah,
why? So why do people keep on doing the same things? I suppose it's the corruption of power, isn't it? You believe. I don't know what they believe. Sorry, I don't even really want to go there, to be honest.
Well, it says a lot about the nature of God in relationship to that as well, because God is with the servant, and God, you know, God is on the side of the servant, and God is valuing what the servant is doing, and God is not manipulating the situation. It's, you know, God is not controlling humanity in a kind of dominating kind of. We haven't got a dominating God. We've got a God who actually sits with the servants. You know, who sits with the ones who are taking the brave stands. You know, the ones who are working for righteousness, the ones who are suffering unjustly, and you know, the fact that whoever this was, if this was somebody who got impaled in Babylon, you know, or a man, you know, Palestinian who got crucified by the Romans, you know, whoever it was, God is identifying with that servant, you know, the one who's despised and rejected.
Yeah.
And that's a very radical faith.
Yeah.
No wonder people try and turn it around and distort it.
Yes. And in many ways, we could be seen as the ones, because we're rich and we're powerful, we could be seen as the ones who are on the wrong side, if you like.
He has borne our iniquities.
Yeah. Walking away, ignoring.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's right.
So you can see why it's a kind of fundamental passage for.
Yeah.
Thank you for one.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much.
See you next week, and we'll talk about Jesus.
Is that a promise?
That's a promise, yeah.